Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The History Blokes, the podcast where we talk about interesting facts, strange stories, and fascinating people from Australia's history. I'm Chris McComb.
I'm Conan Elphick.
And we're coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. And Conan, it's been a little while since we've done a podcast.
It's been a disturbingly long time. I'm sure our listeners have suffered immeasurably. I think we owe them an explanation.
I think we do. What on earth have we been up to for 2 months?
Well, I had to go... Well, I didn't have to. I went overseas for about a month. I got back, had my gallbladder out, which was an experience. I was going to bring some gallstones for you, Chris.
Oh, really? Yeah. Just to pop them on the table so we could stare at them whilst recording the podcast.
Yeah, but I asked my surgeon afterwards whether she kept any for me. And she said, look, I used to do that. But then I found that some of my patients were eating them. So I stopped.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Jeepers creepers.
I have to say my heart sank when I heard that, Chris. I'm old enough to know that basically humanity's doomed. But when you hear stuff like that, you think, oh...
I'm going to presume it was by accident. Surely,
well,
surely some
how could it be by accident? Well, yeah, I suppose
incredibly drunk.
If you had the jar next to the macadamias, yeah, maybe it would be accidental. No, I think it was very deliberate.
Oh, that horrifies me. So, okay.
And then you went to Hawaii for a couple of weeks, didn't you?
I certainly did, yes. A couple of weeks, R&R with a toddler. Actually, it's just with a toddler. I got to travel around Hawaii, spending an obscene amount of money. And don't get me started about tipping.
No, I really don't want to hear your views on that. Yeah, okay.
All right, so it has been a couple of months. It is great to be back.
Yes, it is.
What are we going to be talking about today, Conan?
Chris, dead white men, of course, or dead white man, Charles Kingsford Smith. The reason I decided to focus on him, he was a great aviator, and that gives you a chance to chime in with your recollections of being aloft.
But I'm very much happy to regale you with stories of my amateur piloting. But Sir Charles, of course, was one of my father's heroes. So he had like a whole bookcase full of Kingsford Smith related material.
Right.
I did not indulge, I must say, but he's certainly well recognised in my family.
Oh, okay, right. Yes, and also the other thing that I thought was slightly intriguing about him was that he suffered from mental illness, and he was surprisingly quite public about that. So I thought that's probably something that's not generally well known about him.
That's incredibly impressive about someone who can succeed irrespective of whatever ails him, particularly those afflictions, but also being open at that time in history would have been highly unusual.
But before we get into him, the usual quiz, Chris.
Oh my God!
But Chris, it's obviously going to be aviation themed, so this is your strong point.
Do we do this in the Black Box episode?
Which means, of course, if you don't get most of the questions right, what does that say about your commitment to all things?
Let's just don't go to aviation regulations. I'm yet to do my written exam, please.
So, Chris, an easy one. What are the control surfaces on an aircraft?
Okay, sure. Certainly. Let's start at the back of the aircraft.
Okay.
So your rudder,
yes,
clearly. Your elevator, your ailerons, and of course your flaps, although that's more of a stall speed thing.
Yeah. That controls the speed. Once you're coming into land, when you're taking off.
Increases drag. Obviously, you slow down, but you're also able to fly at slower speeds whilst remaining in the air, i.e. not stalling the aircraft, and that's really important.
So you use that when you take off and land?
You do indeed.
And what do the ailerons do?
Ailerons control your roll.
Yeah.
So either to the left or the right, obviously.
So when you're turning left, you're putting the joystick to the left, then one of the ailerons goes up and the other one goes down.
That is correct, and you turn the aircraft.
And you use the rudder as well.
Yeah, you use the rudder to stabilise for the most part, and particularly when you're coming to land.
And the elevator, what's that for?
The elevator, of course, is for going up and down.
Yes. Okay, very good. And question 2, which of the Wright brothers died in a plane crash?
Okay, I'm going to say all.
What? All? How many are there?
All.
You mean both? Sorry. Orville.
Okay.
I thought you said all. Okay.
Orville.
Okay.
Am I right?
No, it was a trick question.
Damn it.
Neither died in a plane crash.
Okay.
I think one of them was injured. I can't remember which. Doesn't matter. Wilbur died from typhoid fever, and Orville died from a heart attack.
Really? They were big on bicycles. They were bicycle manufacturers. It was quite incredible.
Yeah. Question 3. What did Amelia Earhart achieve and how did she die?
How she died is a mystery. She died on a flight. She died on a flight crossing the Atlantic on her return to the United States. I think I'm wrong. I got that wrong.
Return from what?
I don't know. I can't remember.
Yeah. So she died in the Pacific, attempting to circumnavigate the world.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So the only bit you got right was that she was returning to the US. The first part of the question was, what did she achieve?
She was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic.
Very good. Yes.
Hence my confusion with the first question, I suspect.
Yes. Okay. Now, because we are a Trans-Tasman podcast, theoretically, even though we've... I keep intending to devote an episode to the history of New Zealand, but I haven't quite gone around it.
We should.
You should.
Some of the great connections between New Zealand and Australia, like Russell Crowe.
Yeah. So which New Zealander is widely credited with having won the Battle of Britain during World War II?
Having won?
Yeah. Like if one person can be said to have done it, obviously, that's...
I have absolutely no idea.
Sir Keith Park.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, he was at the time, he was an Air Vice Marshal responsible for... He was a flying ace during the First World War, stayed in the Royal Air Force. He was responsible for... He commanded 11 Group. So Britain was divided into various groups, responsible for different regions. 11 Group was responsible for defending southeast England and London. So, of course, he bore the brunt of attacks by the Luftwaffe. Because of the way he organised his group, the inspiration he provided to his men, the tactics he introduced. He was also very self-effacing, he wasn't rank-obsessed, he was very down-to-earth, as you'd expect from an Australasian. And yeah, he was highly regarded and very popular. There you are.
Yeah.
Final question. Who was the first person to break the sound barrier and when? And you might recall this question because it was in the black box, but I just want to humiliate you because I bet you've forgotten.
I have forgotten.
You struggled at the time.
I have forgotten. It was Lee Major.
Lee Major's
in
the $6 million man.
The $6 million man, exactly. I'm just putting that on the record. I stand by my answer. I have no idea.
Do you have any idea when?
I cannot remember, no.
I
would suggest it was probably the late 50s.
Late 40s, 1947. And the man in question was Chuck Yeager.
Oh, of course, yeah. Chuck. Yes, of course. Yes, I know Chuck.
Flying, I think, the X-1. And remember he had a broken shoulder or something?
I recall this. I've seen the X-1 in person when I was in Washington many years ago.
Doesn't that make it worse that you can't remember?
I don't think it had it. It didn't have a mannequin of him sitting behind the controls as such. I remember what it looks like.
Yeah.
The X1. It was
it's pretty primitive.
Aircraft. It is.
Now, so let's get into Kingsford Smith.
Okay.
Yes. So in Australia and internationally in the 1920s and 30s, which is what we're talking about, they were kind of the golden age of record-breaking flights. Many people believe that aircraft would play an integral role in Australia's future. The problem was that crashes and fatalities and the high costs of aviation, among other reasons, meant that it was slow to realise its full potential. Enter Charles Kingsford Smith, known as Smithy. And he was born in Brisbane in 1897, but spent most of his childhood in Sydney. When the First World War broke out, he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force and served at Gallipoli, Egypt and in France.
He served in Gallipoli? That I didn't know.
No. And then he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, the RFC, and it was flying with them that he was badly wounded in a dogfight and was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. Well and truly after the war, the idea for a trans-Pacific flight, for which he is famous, struck Smithy, and he was living in California at the time. But it wasn't until he met Charles Ulm that he was able to think seriously of turning it into a reality. And this is a quote from him about Charles Ulm. He had similar ideas to mine. He was ambitious, he wanted to do something which would make the world sit up. We began to talk of some big feat, which would bring us what we wanted. Fame, money, status.
You know what? He was a man of his time.
And he's honest.
Absolutely.
It's not for king and country.
To a fault. I mean, that's actually brilliant. I think, I wish modern day celebrities could be as overt on their motivations as Charles Kingsford.
That's why we're doing this podcast, Chris.
Indeed. For fame, for money.
Bringing really none of those things.
Groupies.
So it isn't bringing groupies, nor status. The problem was they lacked money, Chris. Throughout the 20s, Smithy worked as a bush pilot and had established a sort of small airline with two colleagues, Keith Anderson and Bob Hitchcock, both of whom shared his enthusiasm for crossing the Pacific. Now, Charles Ulm also served in Gallipoli in France, But he only met Smithy in 1928 when he approached Smithy, Anderson and Hitchcock about setting up a small mail service between Adelaide and Perth. He was an aviation enthusiast, though actually not a licensed pilot. And they were the perfect partnership. Orme was a superb organiser and fundraiser, whereas Smithy was a brilliant pilot. Kingsford Smith was described by another great aviator, Patrick Gordon Taylor, as having the imagination to project himself to situations well ahead of the aircraft, as well as the steadiness of nerve to deal with any situation. Is that how you describe yourself, Chris?
I'd want him to be piloting my aircraft.
Right. But that is the thing. I mean, particularly with fast aircraft, I suppose, that ability to be a minute or so ahead of the plane, right? So that you
need to be anticipating, without a doubt. You don't do anything randomly, or you react, but you're always anticipating. It's only the truly left field issues that you have to respond to in an immediate fashion. For the most part, it's always controlled, it's always measured, it's always anticipated, and you practice like hell all those emergency situations.
Yes, I bet. So to raise money and garner publicity, Smithy and Orme flew a record-breaking flight around Australia in June 1927. It had only been done twice before, most recently in 23 days. But they did it in 10 days, and it made them celebrities and enabled them to raise most of the money they needed. It also cemented Orme's place as co-pilot for the Trans-Pacific flight, much to the dismay of Anderson, who had expected to take that position. He was one of the partners in that.
I see.
The small airline.
Yeah. So Anderson was the equivalent of Michael Collins.
Yes, in the Apollo 11.
It's just circling the moon, playing a support crew, but didn't actually get to place his feet on the moon.
No. Poor Michael Collins.
Indeed.
I've seen him interviewed. As part they had one of those sort of series they do on the Apollo missions. Seemed like a really nice guy.
Sure, he was, for sure. And you need a nice guy, given you need to return to the
not somebody
who's just
going so I'm bored.
It's like going,
I'm going to head back now.
You bastards!
Can you imagine Donald Trump? A man who holds on to vendettas and grudges for
forever.
Yeah, and who will just take that opportunity. The moment the lunar module
he's
departed,
he's on his thrusters on, he's gone, he's out of there.
Now, the difficulties posed by the Trans-Pacific flight were so significant, it was widely thought to be impossible. Firstly, no plane existed that had the range. Secondly, aerial navigation was in its infancy, a critical issue when flying over the sea. So they planned to complete the crossing in 3 very long hops, from California to Hawaii, Hawaii to Fiji, and Fiji to Brisbane. I
actually knew that. I knew
Did you?
that. I did indeed.
Oh, okay. But you say that, but there's no way of knowing now.
No, that's too late.
Yeah. Now, were they to miss Hawaii or Fiji, they would simply run out of fuel, crash and die. So Smithy went to America and bought a 3-engined Fokker monoplane in Seattle, which he named the Southern Cross. He made room for multiple fuel tanks. And Smithy and Orme faced a series of financial and regulatory hurdles, which were overcome with generous support from the New South Wales government, as well as wealthy individuals in Australia and the US. And they hired 2 Americans. So interestingly, the navigator and the radio operator were not Australians. Because they were coming from America to Australia, I guess it just made sense to find local talent. Those men were Harry Lyon and James Warner. And Orme forced both of them to sign a contract that denied them a meaningful share of any riches that might come from the flight.
Oh my goodness. So that status, fame and money thing was kind of their overriding drivers more so than the camaraderie of sharing the success. Yeah. That's outrageous. I had no idea. That's actually outrageous.
Because these guys were sharing the risks equally.
They could die.
Yeah.
At the same time as everybody else. By the way, as the navigator, in that position, I'd wait till they were halfway to Hawaii, and then I'd start my negotiation on my contract.
Right. Yeah. So on 31st of May 1928, they took off from Oakland Airfield, just near San Francisco. And to lighten the load, they all sat on wicker chairs that were not even bolted to the floor. You'd think
that's gold. They're the first and possibly the only people to ever cross the Pacific in wicker chairs.
Well, I'm sure some airlines would happily, if they could get away with it, impose wicker chairs that are not bolted to the floor. Without naming names, what's the worst airline experience you've had?
The worst experience I ever had was on an airline based out of Hungary. And of course, I flew from London to Poland with them and then onwards to Ukraine with them. And the first flight was so late, they didn't want to let us on the second flight, despite it being their fault that I was late in the first place. And so we had to scan all our major luggage through the actual X-ray scanners in the terminal. So checking it in like you do with your hand luggage, except our big suitcases were going through. It was horrible, and I couldn't take liquids, so I'd tip out, all sorts of stuff out of my main bag.
I've been on an airline where one of these cheap European airlines, never fly them again, their boarding passes, they didn't have scanners at this stage, it was a while ago. So it relies on the ground crew to read your boarding pass to make sure that you are on the right flight. Now, I always assumed that when people read the boarding pass, they are actually reading the boarding pass rather than just lifting it up to their face and then handing it back to you. Because what we found was that when we were on the plane, and it wasn't allocated seating, it was a free-for-all, and we all sit down, and it was like musical chairs because two people were left standing. So clearly, it meant that there were two people on the flight who were not going to this particular European destination and were on the wrong plane. It wasn't obviously the two people standing, they were going to the right destination. So someone on the plane was on the wrong plane.
Going somewhere that they didn't realise they were going.
So over the PA system, people saying, okay, this is a flight to blah, blah. So is anyone who is not going to blah, blah, can they put up their hands? No one put up their hands. Cabin crew then came round and checked everyone's boarding pass. Presumably, as illiterate as the people who had checked us coming in on the first place, because and then they couldn't find the people, and so they did it again. I just don't understand how this happened. So that meant that all of our boarding passes had been checked 3 times.
That's insane.
And none of the cabin crew picked up the fact that 2 of these people was going to Barcelona, and we were not going to Barcelona. So we missed our takeoff window, and eventually when these people were discovered, because in the end, the cabin crew said, right, turn to the person next to you and check their boarding pass.
You must be kidding. That's hilarious.
So eventually these poor Spaniards, who obviously didn't speak English, were discovered, and they were booed off the plane. But it was just so unfair because the idiot, illiterate cabin crew should have been booed off the plane.
Or the people reading their tickets in the first place.
And you're also thinking, well, can the pilots read? Anyway, back to Smithy and the wicker chairs. And they obviously didn't have seatbelts either. There'd be no point. Being attached
Can
to
you imagine
a wicker chair.
Bouncing around inside the aircraft, strapped to a wicker chair.
And at altitude, the cabin and cockpit were freezing, as the fuselage was basically made of thin fabric. And this was a particular issue for Lyon and Warner in the back, because they'd failed to bring warm clothing. Not quite sure why that wasn't.
They didn't read the memo?
They didn't read the memo. And the noise of the engines was deafening too, so that Lyon and Warner could only communicate with the pilots by writing on scraps of paper, which they would then pass to the pilots on the end of a stick. And that was necessary because there was a massive fuel tank between the guys at the back and the pilots, so they couldn't just hand it over to them. They needed to sort of stick.
My goodness.
And there was no toilet, of course, either. So
they have like the heads like in some of those old-fashioned, ships of the line, straight over the side.
No.
That'd be cold.
I don't think it was even that. I think they just had to make up their own arrangements. And in fact, we get to that.
Well,
you know how I'm into this sort of thing. So they hit a succession of storms, forcing Smithy to fly blind on instruments only, and a form of piloting that was only in its infancy. Now, this is where your expertise comes in, because to me that sounds fairly straightforward. You've got your altimeter, you've got your horizon, you've got your whatever else. So why is that difficult?
Flying via instruments is something that we learn in our kind of amateur pilot way. However, you need very specific certification to be allowed to formally fly at night, fly through clouds and the like. And the reason is because your experience, your physical experience can be so vastly different from what the instruments are telling you. You think you're going to the left, you think you're going to the right, you think you're pitching, that sort of thing, when you may not actually be doing that in reality. Therefore, it takes some
discipline.
It takes discipline just to maintain those bearings, and also maintain because you don't see the variables, so also maintain your altitude and the plane state despite these variables that are coming at you. So it's fascinating. Like, you can't turn too fast, for example. You need to be very, very methodical in the way that you approach your instrument flying. Whereas, of course, when you're not flying by instrument, you can kind of throw the plane around, because you can see the ground, because you've got your visual, your physical experiences, ground truths.
And what are the key instruments?
Your airspeed is critical. Your altitude is critical. Horizon line, I assume they would have had that in the plane. Yeah, they would have. Yeah. Horizon line, compass, clearly. I think between all of those, you're as close as you can get. But you also have this rate of descent and rate of climb and so on, which is probably helpful, but not as important as those four. Those four instruments, for sure.
Cripes.
And lots can go wrong. These things can ice up and give you all sorts of false data, effectively. So, and I suspect they were fairly rudimentary in those days as well. Yeah.
Controlling the heavy aircraft in those conditions was also very physically demanding, because obviously it was just a mechanical process. And the final leg in particular involved very severe storms and dreadful turbulence. So the windshield leaked and the pilots were soaked in freezing water, and the fuel consumption was a constant preoccupation.
You'd be checking it every 30 seconds. Still enough fuel, we're going to make it to Hawaii.
Warner, the radio operator, was keeping the world apprised of their progress in Morse code. And this was and in Australia, these messages were read out by a commentator over the radio to a rapt public. This was a massive deal for Australia. So it's sort
they
of
would radio on a regular,
regular,
like every hour they'd radio through where they were, sort of thing.
Yeah. Wow. I'm not sure what else he would have said. I assume he included colour of some kind. I'm not sure what I would say under those circumstances. I think I'd moan. I'd just whinge. Because that's what I do on normal flights across the Pacific.
And that's flying it's flying on a modern airline.
Yeah, if I'm in economy class, which I always am, really.
You're sitting there eating your chow mein or your beef stroganoff, and you're complaining.
I'm complaining. Everything's bad. Everything's wrong. The child is crying nearby, either my own or someone else's. I was flying the other day on a certain airline I won't mention, and the pilot came over the PA. He sounded like he had just been knocking it back ever since he took off. But it didn't matter, because I was watching Cocaine Bear on the entertainment system.
Cocaine Bear, that's an actual movie.
Yeah, you've not heard of Cocaine Bear?
I have. I've seen it actually on a plane. I didn't watch the movie. I flipped through it and I go, that can't be real.
It's not only real, it is outstanding.
And is it a bear that snorts cocaine?
Yes.
Oh, for the love of God. It's insane.
It's an instant cult classic, and I would encourage you to get into it. It's probably on Netflix. No, definitely watch it. Very funny.
It's right up there with Sharknado, I suspect.
I've watched Sharknado. I've tried to get enthused. It's silly. I like that sort of stuff. It doesn't quite work. Whereas somehow Cocaine Bear nails it.
I'll be looking out for that next.
It even has an aviation element in it.
What?
It starts on a plane. This guy, it's filled with cocaine. He's the pilot. He decides he's going to dump a whole bunch of cocaine out for reasons that are not particularly clear. But he's also high himself on cocaine. So it's very well performed, that scene. Every scene is well performed. It's a masterpiece.
I'll put that on the list.
You don't believe me?
No. No, I don't.
This is really disappointing. I just don't feel I can progress in this podcast until you agree to watch the first 10 minutes of Cocaine Bear.
Okay. So
will you do that for me?
I agree that I will watch the first, even 15 minutes of Cocaine Bear. But we should get back to the crossing of the Pacific. And if I could just recap for the listeners. So we've got Charles Kingsford Smith, his friend Charles Ulm, the two guys that I can't remember because they have no fame or status.
Yeah, that's right. They're just Americans.
And a cargo load full of cocaine flying across the Pacific with a bear.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Take it from there.
That'd be fantastic to conflate these. If only there was a biopic made about with Elizabeth Banks, the American actor who directed Cocaine Bear. We could get her to do a biopic of Kingsford Smith. That's exactly what would happen. So journey from San Francisco to Brisbane was 11,585 k's. It took 83 hours and 38 minutes. The longest leg was from Hawaii to Fiji, and that was 5,000 kilometers. And that was the longest transoceanic flight that had been made up until that point.
It's incredibly impressive, isn't it? Frightening.
Yeah, I would not do it, particularly as there was no in-flight entertainment system of any kind.
There was passing rude notes back and forth over the gas tank.
Yeah, maybe that did help. Maybe there were humorous exchanges of some kind. We can only speculate. Now, this is where we get to the toilet anecdote, because when they landed at Fiji, they landed on an oval of some kind, a sporting oval. And it just so happened that one of the Americans at that point just needed to go to the toilet. Needed a number two, Chris. I can't absolutely swear that this happened exactly the way it did, but my understanding is that for reasons that, like, they were wearing overalls, I believe. So I think in order to perform his ablutions, it was necessary for him to get almost starkers. And he then had some newspaper and he was sort of making his arrangements and that. He couldn't wait till they landed. So as they were coming in for a landing, this was going on in the back. And as the plane hit the ground, he fell through the thin fuselage and sort of rolled. And bear in mind that there were a lot of spectators, very keenly awaiting.
That's a classic. This is real. This is real.
Yes. He was sprawled on the oval, half naked, halfway through.
Oh my goodness! Halfway through his ablutions, so to speak. Oh my goodness!
I would want to be properly remunerated for that.
I wonder if the Fijians were a conservative bunch at the time. I don't know.
I think they would have found it hilarious. How could he? And he wasn't injured. He wasn't badly injured.
Thankfully.
He was. Now, when the Southern Cross touched down at Eagle Farm Aerodrome in Smoothie's hometown of Brisbane, there were 15,000 people waiting for them. Spectators carried the crew to waiting cars, and about 30,000 more people lined the route to Brisbane Town Hall, where they were feted.
That's an impressive reception, isn't it? We're not known for fanfare in Australia, but that's really impressive.
No, we're not fans of tall poppies.
The question is, did they carry only Charles and his mate, or did they carry the Americans in the rear? That's a good question.
And from Brisbane, they flew to Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra, where tens of thousands also awaited them. There we are.
It's very impressive.
Now, let's, at this point, take a break.
Are we going to the intermission?
We're going to the intermission, or we're going into transit, I should say.
We are going into transit. Welcome to the intermission, Conan. I want to tell you the story of a pilot called Fred Valentik, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances over Bass Strait in 1978. Have you heard of Fred?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. Well, let me give you a bit of a synopsis. So he was a young pilot. He'd hired a Cessna 182L light aircraft. He sort of rented this thing on October the 21st, 1978, on his way to King Island to pick up some friends, apparently. So he left Moorabbin Airport and he's going to return to Moorabbin. So during
where the hell's Moorabbin?
That's Melbourne, basically.
Oh, right.
During this flight, it was about 130 miles, so it's not nautical miles. It's not that far. Valentik, or Fred, he advised air traffic control that he was being accompanied by an aircraft about 1,000 feet above him. He described unusual actions and strange sort of characteristics. Then he reported that his engine had begun running roughly, then finally reported, before disappearing from the radar, that the strange aircraft is hovering on top of me.
Oh.
It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft.
Oh.
Fascinating.
Those were his words?
They were his words, absolutely. Back to ATC. No trace of Frederick or his aircraft was ever found. And a government investigation concluded that the reason for the disappearance could not be determined, but they presumed it was fatal. And 5 years after, an engine cowl, so the sort of bonnet, if you like, was found washed ashore on Flinders Island. It came from an aircraft of similar kind of era, similar type that he was flying at the time.
So it almost definitely was his?
It was, well, we're not sure. Clearly this stirred up a lot of UFO interest, both in Australia and around the world. And I might just go then into a little bit of background on the story and a little bit more details of him, and that is important. He was kind of an experienced pilot. He'd applied a couple of times to join the Air Force and been rejected. He had a reasonably high-level instrument rating, but only 150 hours of flight experience, which is It's okay, but it's by no means...
How many hours do you have, Chris?
I have around 45.
Right. Yeah.
And I haven't got my license yet, but I'm working towards it. I'm working towards it. In fact, I think once I do get my license, we should do a podcast from inside the aeroplane. We could...
In the process of relating how a similar light aircraft plunged into Bass Strait. And you're trying to convince me to go up with you. It's Chris, never going to happen. And there's no reflection on you. It's a little bit of a reflection on you, but it's mostly a reflection on light planes and inexperienced pilots.
So anyway, when he headed off from Moorabbin to King Island, visibility was good, winds were light, and he departed around 6:20 local time. Contacted Melbourne Flight Service to inform them of his presence and where he's going. And he reported again when he reached Cape Otway, effectively, so the lighthouse, which I visited about a year ago. So he reported in...
always have to get in the fact that you've been to these places.
He reported in about 7 p.m. So he'd been flying over land, and from there he basically turned and flew directly south towards King Island. So starting to fly over the water. And at 7:06... Fred asked traffic control for information regarding other aircraft at his altitude. And air traffic control, reported back and said there was none known. He said that he could see a large aircraft which appeared to be illuminated by 4 bright landing lights. He was unable to confirm its type, but said it had passed about 1,000 feet overhead and was moving at high speed. Fred then reported the aircraft was approaching him from the east, and said the other pilot might be purposely toying with him. And I should say, I've actually listened to some of the recordings of this, and it's a little bit scratchy, but you can certainly hear him saying this.
Okay.
At 7:09, air traffic control asked him to confirm his altitude and that he was unable to identify the aircraft. He confirmed his height and began to describe the aircraft, saying that it was long, but it was travelling too fast to describe it in detail. After that, he stopped transmitting for about 30 seconds. The control, once again, asked him to estimate the aircraft size, and with which Fred responded the aircraft was orbiting above him, and that it had a shiny metal surface and a green light on it, which is fascinating. For around 30 seconds more, there was silence, and then Fred reported the aircraft had vanished. There was another 30-second break in communications, and then he reported that it was now approaching him from the southwest. In silence for another 30 seconds, and at 7:12, he reported that he was experiencing engine problems, and he was going to proceed to King Island. There was a brief silence, and then he said it's hovering and it's not an aircraft. This was followed by 17 seconds of unidentified noise, described probably best as a metallic scraping that just goes on and on. And then all contact was lost. And once again, I have listened to the recordings, and it is quite an eerie sound.
How does he sound?
He sounds very Australian, for lack of a better word, on the calls. And he's like, come again, repeat again, this sort of thing. You could tell
he's under control. He's not panicky.
Yeah, at that stage, he's following procedure. Yeah. He's following procedure for sure. Government initiated a search, and that took place, with many aircraft over 7 days, and no trace of the aircraft was found.
But then, do these aircraft? I suppose they're bits of fuselage do float. Do they?
Well, they will. They will float.
So something should have been visible.
Right. That's right. Or oil slick or something to that effect. Interestingly, around that time, others on the shore were reporting that they saw lights and so on over the ocean, which is interesting. But I think those reports may have come in maybe at the same time that this incident happened, or maybe following that. Yeah. So it could be that they heard and they saw something that they didn't see. Who knows? But certainly there were reports that these green lights were over the ocean. So the Department of Transport, which investigated the incident, was clearly sceptical and suggested that he was just disorientated because of his lowish level of experience, and saw his own lights reflected in the water or lights from a nearby island while flying upside down. However, the plane's fuel system would not have enabled him to fly upside down for any length of time. But, of course, the engine did start to have trouble, so who knows? So there are a lot of theories around what happened. A strange story came to light several years after the incident. Make of this what you will, but a farmer the following morning at Cape Otway...
have you been there?
Not to the farm, no. Observed a flying object hovering over his property at the time. The object was around 30 metres across, and it appeared to have a small airplane attached to its side.
What?
According to the farmer, the attached aircraft was leaking oil. He was so disturbed that he etched the aircraft's tail number into one of his tractors so as he wouldn't forget it, and the number matched Fred's Cessna. Make of it what you will. Certainly from the professional pilot community, they really do place the incident fairly at the feet of Fred, the pilot, suggesting that, basically he got disorientated, maybe he was flying in cloud, although it said it was a clear day, maybe he was accidentally flying the plane upside down, all sorts of pilot error that might feed into that. And of course, there's conjecture between those who wish it to be one set of circumstances versus the highly sceptical.
Yeah.
And I would suggest that the government was quite sceptical, of course, as they should be when they're approaching these situations, when they did the investigation. And no determination was made at all.
So where do you fall?
I'm not going to say either way here. I will leave it up to the listener to make up their own minds. It's a fascinating story. It's a disturbing story.
It's weird.
It was globally famous, I believe, at the time.
Well, if UFOs are involved, it's nice that they're bothering to sort of pop down to Tassie and Australia generally.
That's right. That's right.
It's flattering, if anything.
That's right. And there was, I'm trying to be very sensitive in my approach to this story because it's a young man that probably died in a flight.
In contrast to what I just said.
Indeed. But
so this relates to an experience you've had?
No, all I was going to say was I went down to the Otway Lighthouse, and there is a plaque there, regarding Fred and his final flight. It covers off on some of the aspects of the story, and which is quite moving. This is the last place he was seen, and then you're kind of just looking over ocean. So it's quite it's quite moving. At least one of the articles I read suggested he was into UFO conspiracies. So the question is, was it an act of self-harm? Mm-hmm. Was it an elaborate ruse just to cover up his disappearance? In this case, why? Where did he go? What was he doing? Or thirdly, did something very strange happen to this aircraft as it was flying towards King Island? It might be seen as out of this world.
Excellent, Chris. But we shouldn't let that deter the listener from visiting King Island. If I may try to one-up you on this, I have been to King Island. Have you been to King Island, Chris?
I've never been to King Island.
Well, there we are. And I can say that if you're into cheese, then King Island is very much for you. If you're into lighthouses, and if you're into shipwrecks, it's strong on that.
Really, I am into shipwrecks.
Yeah.
The old school... It's got some square rig sort of...
Yeah, there's quite a few of those which are less visible, but there's one on the beach which was a steel trawler or something. So obviously, because of its position on the roaring 40s, ships were smashing into all the time, hence the lighthouses. Yeah, it was towards the end of a relationship. I don't think it helped our relationship, because it was my idea to go to King Island. Yeah, I think this sort of precipitated the demise of that relationship, let's put it that way. But I don't entirely blame King Island for that. I think I might have been a factor. Chris, thank you for that. That was very illuminating. Good. Okay, well, let us return to Smithy. Smithy continued to achieve a number of firsts and break several records. Initially with Orm. These included flying non-stop across Australia, also from Australia to New Zealand and from Australia to England. From England, they flew east to west across the Atlantic and on to Auckland. So that made them the first people to fly around the world roughly following the equator. All of those journeys put together. Smithy also flew west to east across the Pacific. Meanwhile, the strain of the constant daredevil flights exacted a toll on Smithy's mental and physical health. He began to get panic attacks, especially over long stretches of open water.
Understandably.
Yes.
Understandably.
So, commendably, as I said before, he was always very public about the issue. And it's interesting, isn't it, that despite getting those panic attacks, he would continue to fly these sort of daredevil flights.
Kind of just kept pushing through, didn't he, really?
Yeah, I guess it gets sort of a bit addictive.
Yeah. And in terms of your ability to engage and understand your illness, you wouldn't have had an option back. Who are you going to talk to? Psychology was definitely taking off and so on, but there was just nowhere near the societal understanding of the issues that there is today.
Yeah, and I'm afraid I don't quite know why he was so public about it. It might because it wouldn't necessarily have been known that he was having problems. Maybe it got out in some way. I'm afraid I can't actually answer. It might have just been that he, simply recognised that he wouldn't have been alone experiencing this kind of thing and felt the need to sort of publicise it. And I can't really elaborate, I'm afraid, without straying into the realm of bollocks.
And we never strain
No,
the here.
no. We come close to the border occasionally, but we never cross it. Charles Orme was killed, unfortunately, in December 1934 when his plane disappeared near Hawaii. So, in fact, your intermission, unfortunately, does connect very closely to the fate of both Orme and Smithy, who also died.
Yeah, I wonder whether he was trying to achieve some feat when he died.
Yeah, his plane crashed off the coast of Burma in November 1935, and it's probably due to engine failure.
Smithy's plane?
Smithy, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was still going on about it.
Orme. So they both basically died in the same way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So in terms of the significance of Smithy, he was considered by many Australian and overseas aviators to be the finest, most daring pilot in the world. And this is at a time where you've got Amelia Earhart, you've got Lindbergh. You know much about Charles Lindbergh? Who's the American equivalent, basically. He was the first person to cross the Atlantic.
And
I mean, so he was like Smithy in that respect, but later on in life, two things characterised his later life. Can you happen to know what they are? Something to do with aviation. No. One, his baby child was abducted, of all things.
Wow.
And if my memory serves me, I don't think that he survived, unfortunately. So the child was kidnapped, ransomed, and I don't think he survived. Very sad. The other thing was that Lindbergh became a fascist sympathiser. Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow.
Very pro-Hitler, and most unfortunate. There are.
Wow.
Anti-Semitic.
Talk about a hero that's fallen from his pedestal, that's for sure.
Yeah, but I think he had a lot of support. I don't think he was a pariah until perhaps later, until after the Second World War, perhaps. But certainly in the 30s, of course, anti-Semitism was rife across the world.
Yeah, that's right. There was a lot. There was a real kind of groundswell of that horrible thing. Absolutely.
As for Smithy, so for a country the size of Australia to produce someone like him, it was a source of intense national pride, as we've seen earlier from the turnout for when he arrived in Australia and from the way people avidly listened to their broadcasts. So both Kingsford Smith and Orme show that it was possible for regular air services to deliver mail and passengers to and from the US, Asia and Europe. That was also one of their achievements. And their record-breaking flights and international celebrity status stimulated interest in aviation in Australia and around the world. And of course, in terms of a legacy, we also have Sydney Airport was named after him.
Of course.
And the Southern Cross, do you know where that happens to be on display?
That's at Sydney as well, isn't it? Near the airport somewhere? Am I wrong?
That might be a replica.
Okay.
But the actual aircraft...
No, I don't know.
Brisbane Airport.
Is that at Brisbane Airport? The actual aircraft?
I believe so, yeah.
Wow.
And there's a bomber, actually, at Canberra Airport. I tried to get my daughter interested in it the other day. I was pointing at the various flaps and ailerons.
And was she interested?
No.
Oh.
Even though she was going through this phase where she wanted to be a pilot. And I thought, well, you want to be a pilot, you'll be taking interest in this. Here's a plane, you can actually look at a plane right now.
Absolutely.
She said, no, I want to go to the duty-free in the shops and the cafe.
The duty-free way.
I thought, I don't think being a pilot's on the cards for you, my dear.
No.
So next time, Chris, I thought we might look at Miles Franklin, the author.
I look forward to it, and this may come as no surprise, but I'm not super familiar with Miles Franklin and her history. Therefore, I'm very much looking forward to it. And I thought I was pretty familiar with Kingsford Smith, but I still learnt a huge amount this episode. I think it's been great. I really enjoyed this. Thank you, Conan, and thank you, listeners, for rejoining us, and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Sounds good. Okay, until next time. Bye.